Good afternoon, and welcome to Day 3 of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Annual Conference. The conference theme this year is Business Unusual. A rapidly changing world calls for adapting peacebuilding in Africa. And our discussions thus far have been addressing exactly those things and have been offering interesting and innovative and new thoughts. Today's session is on terrorism in Africa, the state of play, and possible solutions. My name is Nancy Walker, and I'm serving as a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center Africa Program. And on behalf of the Wilson Center, the Africa Program, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, thank you so much for joining us in person and online. For those of you just tuning in, let me tell you about the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP. It's a network of 22 African policy and research organizations that work with the Wilson Center Africa Program to bring African voices and analyses, perspectives, and ideas to key issues in U.S.-Africa relations. Funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since 2010, the project provides avenues for African researchers to engage with, to inform, and to exchange perspectives with U.S. and international policymakers in order to develop inclusive policy frameworks on the issues of peacebuilding and state building in Africa, including our topic today, terrorism. This annual conference is particularly timely. As we know, the Biden-Harris administration issued its strategy for sub-Saharan Africa, which was presented by Secretary of State Antony Blinken in South Africa in August. And it addresses, and our discussions have been taking up very much the theme of business unusual as we put themes in context of the strategy. In addition, this conference is timely because in December, President Biden will welcome African heads of state to a U.S.-African Leaders Summit, and our SVNP members are exceptionally well qualified to provide concrete, practical recommendations to U.S. policymakers in advance of the summit. Today's theme, the landscape of violent extremism and terrorism in Africa, has certainly evolved, particularly in hotspots in southern Africa and coastal West Africa. The Islamic State's expansion in particular has driven some of this evolution. However, underlying drivers and complicating factors are related to climate change, resource competition, external and non-state actors, and social grievances, among other challenges, certainly add to the complexity. What does this mean for peacebuilding in Africa? Are the current responses sufficient? Hopefully our event will assess the state of play, how it has evolved, the impact of global developments, and we'll talk about current responses and strategies with a view to analyzing their effectiveness and if they should be updated, and if so, how. Finally, we hope to provide, as we have done in all of our panels, some practical policy recommendations to build sustainable peace across the continent of Africa. With that brief context, I would like to introduce our speakers, Ms. Oge Onobogu and Mr. Mark Stamilio. Each of them has been asked to speak on a topic from their own perspectives and offer recommendations or areas of focus to enhance peace building in Africa. Afterwards, we will have plenty of time for question and answers. And as always, we are live tweeting today's events and taking questions online. We enthusiastically encourage our online audience to submit questions either through our Twitter account @AfricaUpClose using the hashtag peacebuildinginafrica, or you may tweet us or use the chat box function on the event webpage. Our first speaker is Ms. Oge Onobogu. She is the Director of West Africa Program at the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP, where she leads programming in Nigeria, coastal West Africa, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Gulf of Guinea. In this position, she provides leadership and oversees the design and implementation of projects to mitigate violent conflict, promote inclusion, and strengthen community-oriented security by partnering with policymakers, civic leaders, and organizations. Her thematic focus is on governance, democracy, U.S.-Africa relations, and civil society development in sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining USIP, she managed governance, citizen engagement, and election programs in countries across West and Southern Africa with the National Democratic Institute, and before that, she was the program officer for West Africa at the National Endowment for Democracy, where for several years she oversaw and managed multi-million-dollar grants to civil society organizations across West Africa. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today, to be joined by old friends and hopefully new friends that will make from the audience today. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I want to spend just a few minutes today not really talking about the problem, because we are basically in the presence of people who follow these problems and understand these issues. And I'll be speaking more from the perspective of a practitioner who has been working on these issues for the last couple of years. And I just want to offer a few thoughts for us to ponder as we go into the question and answer session and for the conversation. I think it's when we look at violent extremist groups across the continent, we see that the landscape is evolving. We see that that conflicts are becoming more violent. And we also see that those who are directly impacted by the conflicts today are citizens, those who are often far removed from the capital cities. So conflict continues to evolve, it continues to be dynamic, and it is deadly. And I think for me as a practitioner, when I look at these issues, and I'm really thrilled about the theme for this conference this year, thinking about how we adapt peace building and just coming at it from that notion of understanding that we can't continue doing the same things and expect a different result. And so I'm going to lay out 4 points, and hopefully during the conversation, we will have an opportunity to discuss them further. I think the first is on how we frame the issues, how we talk about the issues. In the work in coastal West Africa over time, conflict evolving in coastal West Africa has often been looked at as a spillover from the Sahel. Even sometimes when we look at the conflict in the Lake Chad Basin area, it's often looked at as, or in coastal West Africa, it's often looked at as coming from outside. There are outside influences. Or even when we think about the conflict that is brewing now in parts of Mozambique, we think about it from the outside. And I have to pause sometimes and tell folks, if we want to do things differently, if we want to think about how we adapt our techniques, we have to be able to frame it properly. Because when we only think about conflict from coming from the outside, we ignore the vulnerabilities within the environments that may be making it possible for violent extremist groups to emerge and continue to thrive. It also impacts the approach that we take. Because when we often view conflict or violence as only a spillover coming in from the outside, very often our approach might be reactionary. And it could be one that could be based on just a security approach alone. So thinking about how we frame the issue, understanding that conflict is dynamic, that even the actors that are involved in the conflict, they change over time. Just like you would do a simple stakeholder analysis, your stakeholders change over time, and the roles that they play within conflicts change over time. A second point is about thinking long-term when we think about our approach to conflict and to resolving violent conflict. Very often when we think about peace-building interventions, sometimes I hear folks saying, oh, we can go into a community, bring several actors together, put together a dialogue, and then we resolve the conflict. It has to be a long-term approach. And so I'm really excited, as in early this year, the US government actually passed a new strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability that is informed by the Global Fragility Act. And within this strategy, I think it's a clear acknowledgement that our approach to addressing violent conflict has to be one that is long-term, has to be one that is informed by the local communities, that takes into account interventions that have already been implemented in the region over time, and actually also has to be a process that can be tweaked over time, that it should be flexible when we think about how we address these conflicts. Understanding that our approach has to be long-term, our approach also has to take a collective approach. We also have to work collectively, understanding that there are other actors in the field. And most importantly, it should be informed by the local context and the local communities. A third point that I want to put on the table for discussion is on our understanding of the political economy. Very often when we frame conflict, if we're now thinking about how we do things differently and how we adapt our peace-building approaches, very often conflict is, when we talk about violent conflict or the actors involved in the conflict, we typically talk from the perspective of ideology, or there are ethnic conflicts or ethno-religious conflicts, or this is a battle between ideologies. And sometimes I have to pause and say, there is also an economic angle to this too as well. Let's take into the context the political economy of conflict here. Why do some conflict actors emerge? Why do we have militant groups, for instance, in places like the Niger Delta region of Nigeria? Why do you have militant groups in areas like this that continue to emerge and thrive, even though you've had years and years of peace-building intervention? Why do we see the emergence of bandits in northwestern Nigeria? And why do we see those who use kidnapping as a tool, basically? So we have to understand the economics of it. Very often we'll say, well, there might be someone on the outside benefiting from the conflict. That's why the conflict continues. But also within the economies itself, we also have to think about those informal economies that have emerged because of conflict. So the lines are blurred. There's certain communities that have also, because they haven't been, responded to by the government, hasn't been able to reach some of their needs. Because of those conflicts, some of them have also formed their own economies around there to sustain their livelihoods. So at the end of the day, if we set up an approach that doesn't take into account the economies that may have emerged, we may actually end up doing more harm to local communities, many of them that have found a way to thrive in these environments. So when we think about how we adapt our peace-building approaches, when we think about how we should ensure that we do not do business as usual when it comes to peace building, these are things we have to keep in mind because these environments are changing. I think that there's a lot more work on conflict economies that has been done in studying conflict in the Middle East. I would love to see more of that type of work done on the continent. And I think a last point that I want to leave us with as we think about how we adapt our peace-building approaches is, apart from thinking about how we frame the issue, not always focusing too much on the threats. There are threats, but sometimes when we focus too much on the threats, we ignore the opportunities that exist. We ignore the strengths that are there. We ignore the partnerships that could be made. Because at the end of the day, the change that we seek to bring into communities have to be sustainable. And for these things to be sustainable, they have to be driven and owned by the communities. They cannot be owned from the outside. So when we view things as only a threat, we end up being reactive instead of being proactive. So one last point to leave us with is that as we think about how we adapt our peace-building approaches and think about how we change or adapt our business model in peace-building, to also think about how we prioritize the opportunities that exist in the environments where we work and not focus only on the threats.
Thank you very much. Food for thought and indeed business unusual. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mark Stamilio from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's the Principal Director in the Office of African Affairs. He has newly come to this office, has a background, as many Foreign Service officers do, you move from portfolio to portfolio, and that's also the same case, which folks don't necessarily know with civilians in some of our larger executive departments. So he has previously served as the Deputy Director for Russia and Conventional Arms, Director for International Humanitarian Policy, Director for Counterterrorism Partnership Strategies, and Director of Detainee Policy. And prior to coming over to the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, he was a Foreign Service officer with the State Department in Colombia, Paraguay, and the Office of the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes. and he was a U.S. Army Judge Advocate General in Panama, Honduras, and Germany. He said earlier that he's a recovering lawyer. There are many of those in Washington, D.C. He received his Bachelor in Arts from Georgetown University and a law degree as well, plus a master's degree from the National Security Strategy section of the National War College. So, Mark, give us your thoughts on where OSD is thinking about terrorism, and welcome to the Africa world.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. In addition to being a recovering attorney, I am recovering from a cough. So I have cough drops and water up here. Thank you. I had a very bad case of bronchitis a couple of weeks ago, and the cough won't seem to go away. So talking dries out my throat, and then I might start coughing. So I'm prepared for that. So as Dr. Walker mentioned, I'm the Principal Director for African Affairs at the Pentagon. Chidi Blyden is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense that I work for. I'm her deputy, and we report through the Undersecretary for Policy to the Secretary and advise the Secretary on regional and functional issues across the globe, basically a little foreign policy shop within the Pentagon. I've only been in this particular office for less than a year. I started last November, but I've been in policy at the Pentagon for 15 years and working on complex problems of this nature for about 30 years. So what I've tried to do in my first 10 months is really study the problem and try to understand the root causes, all the different dynamics. I have read about 5,000 years worth of African history. While I was sick, I had a couple of really good books by Martin Meredith and dug into that. So I have gotten to the point where I understand the context enough that I feel like I'm somewhat qualified to make some observations and maybe help the people who really understand Africa steer things in the right direction. I'm going to lay out for you how the U.S. government and really the Department of Defense in particular sort of views the security problem, and then a little bit about how we are approaching our help in terms of trying to help others solve some of these problems. In terms of the problem set, there are a number of security challenges on the continent, but the two that concern us most are violent extremism and then the disruptive activities of malign actors, and that's code for Russia and China. Not that everything Russia and China do is bad, but there are things that they do that we think are disruptive and counterproductive to security and stability on the continent. Underlying those security challenges, we see some sources of fragility in terms of development, economic opportunity, food and water scarcity, and governance, and then some other aggravating factors such as COVID, climate change, population growth. What I came to understand in my first 10 months here is that all of those things intersect. This is not just a security problem that we can solve with security solutions. All of those things interact with each other. Some are causes, some are effects. They're probably all cause and effect in what I have come to describe as a vicious cycle. Some of the fragility leads to insecurity. The insecurity leads to discontent, which is one of the reasons that the violent extremist organizations come out. If governance is not strong and not able to deal with the violent extremist organizations, some of these malign actors slip in. They're propping up authoritarian regimes. That leads to abuses. That leads to more discontent, and that continues the cycle. That's how I view the problem after a short while studying it. It's a complex problem set that requires a complex solution and a long-term solution, as my colleague said. The DoD approach to this is part of a whole of government, U.S. government approach. I'm going to describe the DoD approach first. Basically, the National Defense Strategy lays out three priorities for the Department of Defense with respect to the continent of Africa. We're to counter violent extremist organizations that threaten security and stability on the continent, strengthen ally and partner networks to support mutual security objectives, and address targeted strategic competition concerns that present a military risk to the United States. Additionally, the President's National Security Strategy lays out three C's: COVID, cyber, and climate change, that are all intertwined in this. And the Secretary of Defense has made it very clear that our department Even though people think of us as the warfighting department, we are going to help the rest of the U.S. government address those other 3 Cs. The combatant commander at AFRICOM has reminded us that we also have an enduring objective of responding to crises on the continent that affect American interests or not. So, we often help with disaster relief and things like that, but we also have an obligation to our diplomats and military personnel on the continent who are operating in high threat or high risk environments. Our general approach to all of this is, it's a tired phrase, but by, with, and through partners. I haven't found a better phrase for that, so I'll use that. We are not there in and of ourselves. We are there to work by, with, and through our partners. Additionally, we are there as part of what we call a 3D solution. And by 3D, I mean the 3 branches of government: development, diplomacy, and defense. So everything that the Department of Defense is trying to do is in the context of that 3D approach. There's nothing that we are trying to do on the continent that isn't part of that sort of whole of government solution. With respect to the violent extremist organizations, that's a very good example of how we're working by, with, and through. Everything that we do in that regard is with allies and partners. It's also part of the 3D whole of government approach to the continent. There are different tiers of VEOs, and we obviously look at the ones that are a threat to U.S. homeland or U.S. interests as particularly grave from our perspective, but we're also concerned about the ones that threaten regional stability and security more broadly. In terms of allies and partners, we have a set of anchor states that we're trying to develop into security exporters. You always hear about trying to find African solutions to African problems. Part of the way we're trying to do that is to build certain anchor states that can help regionally with some of the security problems that come up. My boss, Chidi Blyden, also likes to talk about the coalition of little guys. We don't want to focus solely on the anchor states. We want to make sure that all 53, our office has 53, I know there's 54 on the continent, but we've divided Egypt into the Central Command area. But all 53 of the states that we are working with are important, and we want to make sure that everybody is included in any discussion or solutions that we have to problems. We also recognize that in addition to working through allies and partners in terms of countries, that some of our partners are going to be multilateral organizations and regional bodies, and a lot of the solutions that we're seeking to help with incorporate them. Likewise, there are a lot of European allies and partners involved in the solution. For better or for worse, we are trying to work by, with, and through some of them as well. In terms of strategic competition, the third prong from the National Defense Strategy, I would say that our main concerns with Russia are disinformation campaigns and the proliferation of private military companies. With China, it's more about predatory lending and the monopolization of supply chains. But both of them also concern us from the aspect of supporting and propping up authoritarian regimes that are going to ultimately undermine stability and security on the continent. I'm going to stop there. For me, this is, again, I described it as a vicious cycle. It's a whole of government problem from an African nation position that also requires a whole of government solution. And as in terms of business unusual, that's a somewhat new approach for the U.S. government. We're trying to address this as a whole of government problem from our own perspective. And I have to say, in terms of the 3D approach, the D that I represent, defense, is by far the smallest of the 3. We view the longer-term problems with stability much more through the development lens and the diplomacy lens than through the defense lens, but we recognize that the defense piece has to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to not only... We're going to get to applaud again, but thank you both. Provocative and business unusual. Let me invite the members of our audience, both in person and online, to offer up some of your most provocative questions, because I know these speakers can handle them. Please introduce yourself and your organization and ask a question. We are not looking for, yes, you heard me grit my teeth. Please ask a question so that we can involve as many people as possible in this afternoon's discussion, which I know will be lively. 1, and we'll take 3 questions. Well, we'll take 4, and then we'll do another round, and hopefully we'll have some questions from our online audience. Please don't be bashful out there.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rigobert Minani. I work for a center called CEPAS, Center for Studies and Action DRC, and it's in Kinshasa. I understand that you have three pillars: diplomacy, development, and defense. I presume that the diplomacy, when they work, they take advice for the professional of the defense, those who addresses this question of insecurity and violence. So my question is, I'm speaking from the situation of my own country. We are facing a group in the eastern part of the Congo called ADF that has the root from Uganda, an Islamist group that have been labeled a terrorist group. Before they label a group like that, what interaction is between the defense component and diplomacy? Second, if we local, we want to address the issue, and that is the case today, and we want to go beyond that because we don't share the same definition of being integrist. How do we proceed? Speaking from a concrete experience, we have a group there that is very composite. You have Islamists, true, but you have also local people, true. And no one wants to address anyway because the US have said these people are terrorists. So you don't talk of terrorists. And yet, among them, we have our children, we have members of our families. So how do we address them? And we have the impression that in this kind of matters, it is the diplomacy that takes the lead instead of the professionals of the defense. Thank you.
Thank you. Tilia?
Thank you very much. I'm Otilia Anamaunganidze from the Institute for Security Studies. You've spoken to the multifaceted approach, so to speak, but what we know is that the overwhelming response, so to speak, to violent extremism and terrorism has pivoted on the defense side, so on military engagement, even as the problems or the issues on the ground are not military problems. Referencing work that we've done as an organization within the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, the littoral states in West Africa, the Horn, and in Mozambique. Across all those regions, one of the leading elements raised by communities affected most by this violence are inequality, marginalization, and a distance between themselves and service delivery from the state. My question then is, will we ever see soon or in the near future the development aspect being the bigger part of the pie? So still incorporating defense, still incorporating diplomacy, maybe considering mediation and talking with some of the groups, but really reducing the inequality gap, reducing the marginalization and the concerns about not being part of the state.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone first? One and then two. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Chukwemeka is my name, West African Network for Peacebuilding. Oge and I come a long way, so she's already aware. I wasn't going to allow her to run away with some of those beautiful presentations she made. And therefore, I'm just going to take you up on three of them. The first one is the externality framing of conflict and violent extremism with regards to it's been a spillover, especially in the coastal West Africa. And my question is, isn't that what is convenient for everybody? In the US here, same offense, different ascriptions, you know. If it is within, then it doesn't have to be terrorism. If it is from outside, then it is terrorism. So I think every state is comfortable looking at it from external. It's not just in West Africa where they think it's spillover from North Africa or all of that. The second thing is that it is fascinating to hear about the long-term approach. I hope that indeed it will be long-term approach because, like I said yesterday, all development partners, most of them that invest in Africa, look at it as an investment that requires short-term profit, as it were, like a business where you have 20 years of protracted conflict and you want solution in 2 years with a metrics that comes from most of these institutions, including USAID. A matrix that says, what result did you see, what impact did you see, and so on and so forth. And then you put development partners, NGOs, under tremendous pressure to produce results that are cosmetic. The third thing is on the political economy. And this is also very fascinating, but we also need to spread the net to capture everybody within the angle of political economy. Africans have also accused superpowers of being part of the political economy, whether it's in terms of the arms that they sell or the natural resources that exist in African states, or in terms of the geopolitics that they want to acquire new friends and make new foes. So let's spread the net and capture the entire political economy and go to the extremism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicholas Ozo is my name, from the African Technology Policy Studies Network. And I'm just going to take it up from where Chukwuemeka has dropped it, and that is your framing on political economy with respect to the state of terrorism in Africa. And my challenge or my question is, what happens when the state itself is compromised in this political economy because they have both political and economic interests in that terrorism? And you agree with me that there are clear evidence, you were referring to Northwest Nigeria. I will give critical examples where there are that political and economic interest with respect to provision of arms for the terrorists by state, sharing of ransoms by state, provision of covers by state itself, as well as exposing formal security personnel to vulnerability and attacks by the terrorist groups. And one example I will give is what happened in Adamawa, where a kingpin was escaping, and formal personnel structure was set against him. But then, because he's connected to a top military brass, the military brass provided cover and killed official security personnel and saved the terrorist and kept him in their barracks. And yet, the rest is history, and I know you know this very well. So where state is compromised, how do you think we are going to get a solution, and whether short-term or long-term? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for passing the microphone along to our colleagues.
Thank you very much. My name is Mziwandile Ndlovu. I work with the African Institute for Development Policy. My question is directed at Mark. When you spoke about some of the issues that you have your eye on in Africa. I took note that you mentioned China as one of the actors that might be involved in activities that are not in the interests of peace or peace building on the continent. My question is, how possible is it for the Pentagon or the US administration to be able to deal with issues concerning China objectively without treating China as a foreign policy adversary on the continent in as far as exerting influence on the continent is concerned? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to start? Go for it.
I could go ahead and start. And thank you, Chukwuemeka and Nicholas, for throwing out the hard questions. And I will do my best to try to respond to them. But in my response, I also want to put a challenge out to you all too as well. So on the question of the convenience of the definition of the conflict, it is true what you said. Sometimes it's often convenient to find an explanation to help inform the approach. But then if we are thinking about business unusual, if we're thinking about our approaches, then this is when we should challenge that convenience. I remember several years ago, there were ongoing discussions when this was in the around 2008, 2009, thereabout, when Boko Haram was just emerging in Nigeria. And there were ongoing discussions about whether it was right to classify them as a terrorist group or not. Because once they're classified as a terrorist group, then it changes the approach and ignores the vulnerabilities within the country that is leading to the rise of these, of a group like that. Clearly, Boko Haram is a violent group, but those types of discussions, those types of conversations are conversations that we should also be having now as we see the emergence of several types of violent extremist groups across the region. When we think about the bandits, as they're labeled in northwest Nigeria, those are homegrown violent extremist groups. And the approach for them, the approach for addressing those types of issues cannot be one from the outside. Even if there can be lessons learned from the outside done in cooperation with those within the country, but your solutions have to come from within. So to the point you made about, yes, describing a conflict, describing the spillover effects as being convenient, it could be, but that's a challenge. That we should not only accept convenience, because when we accept convenience, it informs our approach. And very often the approach that we may end up taking may not lead to a sustainable outcome. To the point about long-term, and I will just answer a bit of that, and Mark can follow up on that. I mentioned briefly about the new strategy that was just passed. So this is a strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability that is informed by the Global Fragility Act. And so the strategy identifies several countries, and within the continent, Mozambique and 5 countries in coastal West Africa are identified under this new strategy. It's still undergoing its process and to begin implementation soon, but I think that is a step in the right direction because it acknowledges that what we've been doing over time on the continent has not been yielding the types of results that are desired. So it presents an opportunity for us to think about how we approach things differently, to think about how we approach things more from a long-term perspective, understanding that governance as well is a key aspect that needs to be taken into account. And this will dovetail into the question that Nicholas had about, how do you address this issue when you think about the political economy, when the state is also part of the problem. Again, this is my challenge out to you all. As I said, there's a lot of research on this that has been done. Well, not so much, but some research has been done on this in the Middle East, trying to think about how you engage effectively in peace building in these environments when the state is also part of the problem, because you find out that sometimes we partner with states, and it's difficult to create when you have these types of partnerships. It's often difficult when the state itself is also part of the problem. So how do you engage directly with the people themselves? How do you get the people involved in the process, in the discussion? And so this is my challenge out to you all too, as well, as in we would love to see more research in this area to help inform how practitioners like myself and others who work in this field can engage properly and adapt our peace building approaches to ensure that we are creating the right partnerships, identifying the right partners, and working towards the sustainable outcomes that we would like to see.
Thank you. Mark?
Yes. I'm going to try to address some of the themes that I heard collectively in the questions. One on the the 3D approach. We look at it as synergies. It's not necessarily how do defense and diplomacy interact, for example. It's how do all three of these things interact with each other. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? In some cases, I'm thinking back to when I worked on Afghanistan issues, for example. There was a move at one point to develop these judicial centers out in the countryside, these democracy sort of centers of excellence. And in that case, I thought we were putting the cart in front of the horse, that people are not going to come to your judicial centers if they're afraid the Taliban is going to kill them on the way to or from the court, that you have to have a certain level of security before you can address those governance issues. I think it's very different in Africa. I think for the most part across Africa, you're in a position where you can address all three of these simultaneously. And if you don't try to do it simultaneously, comprehensively, collectively, it's going to fail because it's the three legs of the stool. If you take one leg out, the stool falls over. So I'm mixing a lot of metaphors there. But I think it's the synergies, and that's the business unusual of the strategies that the White House is producing for our approach to this problem set is recognizing that we can't just play what we called whack-a-mole. You know, we did 20 years of whack-a-mole was terrorist pops up here, you hit him, the military solution. That's not going to work. You have to address the underlying problems that are creating the violent extremism in the first place. Some of that is governance. Some of that is tied up with those other things that I mentioned, like population growth and economic opportunity and food scarcity. So that's all development. Working with the government institutions in these countries is the diplomacy part. And third, a much smaller D in the case of Africa, is the defense part. So it's all interrelated, but again, three legs of a stool that will only stand up if all three legs are there. In terms of the language that we use, whether this is a military problem or not, so even in the United States, we had a debate. We used to treat terrorism as a law enforcement problem. And then we had organizations that were able to conduct military-style operations and take down large buildings and kill thousands of people, and we shifted our thinking to consider it more of a military problem. Whether it's military or law enforcement or something else, it involves violence. So I think that's the key, is that there is a problem of violence that we have to solve not through violence, but through this 3D approach. So I'm not saying that the military has to be involved or police have to be involved, but the people who are committing these acts are being violent. So you either have to address the underlying problems that led to that violence, or you're never going to have a solution. Does that make sense?
It does, but it wasn't my question, but thank you.
Okay, so let me finish and then maybe we can circle back. I think there was another comment about inside and outside terrorism. At least in the United States, we consider both can be terrorism. There's domestic terrorism and foreign terrorism. So I'm not quite sure I understood the question, but at least from our perspective, terrorism doesn't have to be foreign. It can be domestic. And in terms of how we designate organizations to be terrorist organizations, I'm not qualified to speak to that. The State Department actually has that role. So that is part of our diplomacy, not part of our defense. We are, in the DoD, we are charged to go out and address that problem in some ways, but it's the State Department that actually determines which organizations we, the U.S. government, consider to be terrorist. And on the China question, yes, very much so. We have our biases and our opinions, subjective opinions about it. I try to look at it objectively in terms of what's the impact, not just how does it affect the United States. And I think, from my perspective, and that's why I said not everything China and Russia is doing on the continent is bad. There are things, that they are doing to help in ways, but there are trends, and both of those countries seek to replace the current international order with one that favors their authoritarian sort of government, which unfortunately for Africa, I think, is helping not just authoritarian leaders stay in power, but very corrupt authoritarian leaders stay in power. And just as an objective observer, I think that long term, that's very bad for the countries that are engaging in that way. And then the final thing I'll say is that in terms of the long term, not only do we have these new strategies, but for example, under the Global Fragility Act, we're looking to create 10-year plans. So at least for now, we're scoping this out for at least 10 years because we recognize that it has to be, we can't keep playing whack-a-mole with these problems. It has to be a longer-term solution.
Thank you. Let me see if, okay, let's go with another round. 1, 2, 3, 4, from the front to the back. And again, please introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Faith Mabera. I work for the Institute for Global Dialogue from Pretoria. I think I'm going to try and do it very quickly, and it's almost dual-pronged, so you'll see why I'm saying they're related in a way. In any of the panelists, you're free to answer. So
or both.
Yeah, in the same way that violent extremists are adapting their tactics on the strategic landscape, we're also seeing an increased privatization of warfare. And this applies to also handling counterterrorism operations, where we are seeing the turn towards private military contractors, mercenaries, if you will. And this is also, and these PMCs are operating alongside state-led actors. They're also operating alongside multilateral coalitions or ad hoc coalitions, whatever you want to term them. In what ways is this not only going to complicate counterterrorism operations and also preventing violent extremism operations, and how that will also undermine long-term objectives? So for instance here, circle back to what's happening in Southern Africa with Mozambique and South Africa's PMCs, for instance, being implicated in that environment. So the privatization angle, A. And B, this is linked to the question also of, Oge, you mentioned increasingly how Africa is being framed as this nexus, this epicenter of emerging trend lines as far as global jihadism is concerned, right? But also with the and here because I'm speaking to the American policy-making context, in the post-Afghanistan era, and I'm deliberately using Afghanistan as the controversial reference point here, how is the US CVE, and I think I'm just trying to shorten CVE and counterterrorism agenda, and contrast that with the fatigue, donor fatigue and policy fatigue, disillusionment with long-term objectives, and the kind of apprehension about avoiding forever war scenarios. So how is that rhetoric going to balance out with the reality on the ground? And how is it that on paper, as Mark so eloquently put it, you're looking at long-term objectives, but yet the reality on the ground increasingly is towards stabilization operations, which tend to have an increasingly short-term bent to them. So I think squaring that that idea for me, I'd be keen to hear. Thank you so much for indulging me.
Please.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and I appreciate for the informative presentation by panelists. I'm Getachew from the African Institute of Governance and Development of Ethiopian Civil Service University. My question directly goes to Mark. mainly focusing on the East African terrorism related to Al-Shabaab especially. I know that the United States of America, in collaboration with the neighboring countries and organizations, have been playing for a long time in fighting against Al-Shabaab. But still the problem is there, even it's expanded to one of the regions of Ethiopia, that Somali region. So I think what the challenge, now I know that the United States of America has re-engaged in fighting against this organization. So what are really the fundamental challenges, which is not really solved the problem for the last 2 decades? And the second one is what strategies you follow, especially in the last 3-4 months in dealing with this problem. Maybe the third one is what lessons can take from Taliban of Afghanistan in relation to the problem in Somalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Third question, Frederick.
Thank you very much, panelists, for very interesting discussions. My names are Frederick Ogenga from the Center for Media, Democracy, Peace and Security. I would just want to do a quick comment, just to inform you that really what I heard about the local turn and all that, I'm happy to inform you that I'm part of, as the co-chair of the Mozambican working group with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and also a member for the Coastal West African Working Group. I'm happy to report that in part of our recommendations, the local voices were really considered. They are very, very highly, and they impacted on the last communique that is supposed to go to USG. And also there is that idea that M&E strategy has to change. It's not going to be business as usual the way the US has been handling conflict situations on the ground on those parts of the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And in the back, Anas, and then we'll ask our, and then we'll take one more here. Yeah, Anas first.
Anas Al-Gamati from Libya. My question is to Mark. I understand the position that you're describing around values, and that Russia presents a more authoritarian vision for the continent, and that's one of the reasons why the US is countering that on the continent. But in Libya, that was not US policy, and in 2019, the US policy was to defend and threaten to veto any attempt to sanction or criticize Khalifa Haftar, a dual American Libyan citizen, who actually brought Wagner Group into Libya. So I think it's a difficult one to reconcile, and I think that's one of the main issues that we've been discussing throughout the conference proceeding, is that there's a say-do gap. There's a difference between what American policy is explained and said in rhetoric, but there's a difference in policy, and I think that's something that I'd like to hear your commentary about, and see whether or not there are concerted efforts to change that. I think US-African position, still there is cooperation with Khalifa Haftar. There was a Reaper drone that was downed several weeks ago in Benghazi by the Wagner Group, and this is an individual that is still engaged by the US ambassador, still engaged in rhetoric and talked about it as a solution. That's the very individual that brought in the Wagner Group onto NATO's southern flank. So if you could explain a bit of the say-do gap on Libya, because I think it maybe is different to the rest of the continent, but it's certainly the case. The second part of that question is, given that so many authoritarians in the region, particularly in North Africa, have used counterterrorism as a narrative to ally themselves to the US, and then simultaneously drag back the Arab Spring and the democratic movements that were going across from Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Does the US have a position on this, and how do you avoid falling into the authoritarian trap of letting them define who the terrorists are, and the US just say, okay, democracy later then, and we'll just stick with the authoritarians for now?
Thank you. And one more question. Jamie. Come here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, the panelists. I want to appreciate the point that was mentioned by Ms. Oge on the conflicts being an economic issue. I have always personally thought that the underlying cause of conflicts in Africa is not whatever, we talk about, or religion, tribe, and whatever. It's actual resources. And my question is on the strategy. You mentioned that there's a U.S. strategy. Could you tell us more about this strategy and how it's actually going to help address some of these underlying causes of conflicts in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take which ones first? To flip a coin? Your turn.
Okay.
Go for it.
First. So Faith, to your questions about privatization of warfare, donor fatigue, and forever war, I would say that all of those are concerns that we share as well. The privatization of warfare is particularly problematic. I do think it's going to complicate CT. It's a short-term fix for some leaders to bring in somebody who can address an immediate problem, but we're seeing the news reports of the violence that those people are committing, and that's going to exacerbate the problem over the longer term, even in the midterm, not long term. So it's a short-term gain, but a long-term loss for the countries that are doing it. There's an accountability problem as well. I would offer that our view is that the accountability problem with Wagner is a little bit of a ruse. They are not maybe not directed by the Kremlin, but they are certainly connected to the Kremlin. It's a convenient way for the Kremlin to say they're not our troops. So they can kind of have their cake and eat it too when they use those. So there are lots of problems with that, and I do think that it will undermine not just the long-term objectives, but stability and security in the not so long term. I think you're starting to see some of that in some of the countries where they're present. In terms of the donor fatigue, I would say it's more than just donor fatigue. I would say it's everybody fatigue. This is a problem that we have not found the right solution. People can argue about how things went well or not so well in places like Afghanistan, but there are lots of lessons learned from things like that, things that we don't seek to repeat. And the 3D approach is part of that. We've learned that whack-a-mole doesn't work. You can keep whacking lots of moles, but you're never going to solve the problem if you don't address the underlying causes. And also the concept of a forever war. We don't want a forever war. We want a long-term solution that's not a war. So I think that's the whole concept behind the 3D approach, is that we can't spend the next 100 years fighting these forever wars. We need to find solutions that are long-term solutions but aren't wars. So that's how I would respond to that. Gitacho, on your questions about East Africa, I think that's another situation where we've had a long, 30 years of, I'm not going to say failed policy, but unsuccessful policy. And we are revising our strategies. We have made some adjustments recently where we're having our troops that the commander calls it commuting. They were not permanently present and they were flying back and forth, which diminished their effectiveness. That's a small first step, but our office, as my office sort of relooks strategies across the continent, that's one where we're looking, taking a fresh look to see, is there something that we could do differently here? It's also a case where the 3D approach is essential. One of the challenges that we face is, we have to work with the government we have, and in some cases that's not ideal. So the governance part, the other parts of the 3D approach are to help with the governance so that we change the landscape in ways that help us deal with the security problem. So lots of lessons learned from the last 20, 30 years that we're trying to apply there. I have to say I'm not an expert on Libya. I think you probably know way more about this than I do in my 10 months. But I think sometimes we're faced with difficult choices. We have policies that we craft that we do our best to apply across the board that don't neatly fit every situation. And I know this is not a satisfying answer, but I don't feel like I'm qualified really to debate the topic, other than to say very generically that, we do the best we can. I think there are some unusual circumstances here that we're doing our best to address. And frankly, sometimes our best just isn't good enough. But I will study this problem. It's one of the things that I want to dig in deeper over the next 6 to 12 months with my team. There are 5 or 6 sort of big problem sets that I want us to focus on, and I think this is definitely one of them.
Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So I will just add on briefly to what you've said, and to address the first question about how we balance this approach when we look at fatigue and ongoing conflict. And the same frustration and questions that you have are the same questions that we're asking ourselves now. Because it's a reality in the environments that we work in. In many of these environments, we've seen protracted conflicts. We've seen this go on for years, and we've seen communities impacted in different ways. So those are challenges that we're having, questions that we're battling with now on how we approach this. And I think in many ways that also informed the new strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. And trying to ensure that the emphasis is not just on stability alone, but that it also addresses the root causes of the conflict. And for several of these conflicts, governance in many ways is also at the heart of what is driving some of these conflicts. So these are some of the questions that folks are battling with now if we want to be able to adapt our approaches. And Francis, thank you for mentioning your participation in the discussions with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, because I actually co-chair the group for coastal West Africa. And that was a priority of those groups, to ensure that the voices of Africans were heard in the process of informing this strategy. Now, it's just in the early days. As Mark had mentioned, the plans that will come out from this are looking over a 10-year horizon. So these are still early days, and it will require consistent, ongoing engagement. Because I think there's a point where sometimes we start something and it's not consistent. It requires consistent engagement. And just to backtrack a little bit, how many of you in the room are actually familiar with, have heard about this new strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability? I'll probably start from that point first. So not many of us, that's actually a challenge for us too as well, that not many folks in this room have heard about the strategy. So that's a key takeaway point for us, that we need to do more to ensure that more people are aware of this, more people are aware that their approach is changing and that there is a desire to do things differently. I think just one last point to leave with, because Mark has already touched on a lot of things, a lot of the questions. As we think about how we do business different and how we adapt our peace-building approaches, I think approaching it from a point of humility, understanding that we do not know. We do not know a lot, and it's important that our approaches are informed by the people. To your point about the drivers of conflict, we see that it's complex. It's not only some conflicts may be driven by economics, some by ideological means, some by different. So it's complex, and you cannot attribute the cause of conflict to one thing. But however, the approach when we talk about peace building, for many of you that are practitioners in some of the communities that we work in, you may have heard people say to you, well, that's great, we've had a dialogue, but I can't eat peace. We're hungry, we need jobs, I can't eat peace. So we have to think about how our approach is, how we think about inclusive economic processes when we think about our peace-building approach. I think sometimes when we have the discussions about peace-building, they're usually separate from discussions on economic development. And I was actually thrilled when I saw that as part of your conversations during this conference that you actually also have a session on economics. Because I think as we think about how we evolve, how we adapt our peace building approaches, it's important that we also bring that aspect into the conversation. Because to be able to ensure that our approaches are sustainable, we have to address some of the key economic issues as well that we see in these environments. So inclusive economic processes should be key in our conversations when we think about peace building.
Any other follow-up from the questions?
I just agree with that wholeheartedly, which is why I hired one of her colleagues to work in my office. No, in all seriousness, we did hire somebody to come in because the people in the Pentagon are really good at tanks and guns and things like that, but we don't always understand this. And one of the things that I learned very early in this job was that there are a lot of other, even though we're working with the other departments on this 3D approach, we need to understand it internally as well. So I brought somebody in who can help us understand that.
I'm sorry? Okay, more questions? No, I don't believe this. I just don't, because, okay. And the other thing is as Oge was saying, yeah, just like, if you haven't heard about the strategy, what are your recommendations? This is just because we have a podium and an audience does not mean that this is not a two-way conversation. So let me invite suggestions for us, for the practitioners here in Washington. How would you like to see information get to you better? But first question, sir. Wait for the microphone, please, and then introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Vuyo from the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. Okay, you mentioned something that, and Mark too, that you are looking at re-strategizing and how you look at all these things. What informs your strategy? Is it top-down or bottom-up? Because I'll be very interested to look at that, and perhaps outside this, then I'll offer my true opinion of what you have just to say. Thank you.
Let's just answer those. Mark, then which?
So our approach in the Pentagon is neither top-down nor bottom-up. It's
circular?
No, I'm sorry. I thought maybe, I wasn't sure I thought maybe my mic was off.
No, you're good.
It's more based on a certain rubric. I spent a whole year at the National War College learning. So the Pentagon's approach to strategy is you start with U.S. interests. And what's the threat to that U.S. interest? What are the ends, ways, what objectives do we want to achieve to mitigate the threat? And what ways and means are available? What's that going to cost? And if it costs too much, is it worth doing it? What's the risk if you don't do it? And if you can't afford the cost, are you willing to assume the risk? Or are you going to pull resources from somewhere else? So that's how we approach strategy within the building. Frankly, we don't do it all that often. Every 4 years or every 8 years, when there's a new administration, there's a flurry of strategy that comes out. The top-down piece that we call strategy that comes from the White House is not what the Pentagon would call a strategy. It's more, some people cynically refer to it as a list of aspirations, but we in the Pentagon view strategy as aligning resources, ends, ways, and means. So that's how we do it in the Pentagon. But the government as a whole, there's top-down ones and bottom-up ones, and then we all try. My organization is actually supposed to bridge the gap. So the combatant commander, we'll call that the bottom, and the White House is the top. They have their ideas that are mostly informed by political considerations, and then the combatant commander is mostly, very in the weeds. And my job is to try to bridge the gap between those and make sure that we have a coherent approach, not a strategy, but an approach to the strategies that everybody else has come up with. That's why we're called the policy. We don't do strategy per se, we do policy, and that's to bridge the gap and tell people how we expect them to implement the strategy.
Mark made an important point about vocabulary, and we all work in different institutions, and within a government there are institutional cultures and where language is very appropriate. And I think when we look at the White House documents called strategy, aspirational it's what we, a U.S. government, we, an administration, want to achieve, which from the military mindset is not the same as putting things together in the way that Mark just explained.
And
so
frankly, if I could just
please,
add,
please.
that is much more effective at getting us the resources we need from Congress than an actual strategy. You would think it's the other way around, but it's not.
Well, part of getting resources is for the leaders to say, these are our priorities, and whether you call them aspirational or as a result of analyzing a threat or available resources. So, Madame, from the outside of government.
Exactly, from the outside of government. So I work with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we are outside of government. So when I say the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, that's a U.S. government strategy. And USIP is on the outside. We're helping to inform the implementation of that strategy in partnership with folks like yourselves and others. So for us at USIP, the way we work, we take more of a bottom-up, top-down approach. And I will give a practical example with that approach and how we implement our activities in country. And I'll use an example of our program in Nigeria, for instance. So on the bottom up, we have engagements at 3 levels in Nigeria, where we engage at the national level, we engage at the state level, and we engage at the local level, ensuring that input from the local level helps to inform what happens at the state level. Our approach in Nigeria is typically working with the state governments, because we realize that on the outside, very often people partner with the federal government of Nigeria. But then when we step down even closer, we realize that the state governments are closer to the people. And in our own approach, we don't just want to have conversations at the top. We want to ensure that the voices of those who are at the bottom tier are also incorporated too as well. So in a lot of our work at USIP, and this same approach really doesn't only apply to what we do in Nigeria, but writ large in a lot of the regional work that we do. It's more of a top-down, bottom-up approach, trying to make sure that both voices from the top and the bottom are meeting and forming consensus.
Let me ask, how can we get information to you that would make your work more effective? What would you want? The U.S. government from the inside, or partners like the United States Institute of Peace, who are working directly with your colleagues on the ground? What's effective? This is not a bashful audience. I'm
not really sure whether it is about the method of information sharing.
Hey, sorry, wait for the microphone, please. Okay. That would help, yeah. And if I've framed it wrong, just...
No, I think we have a constituency we represent. So I don't think I want to be having information from Mark every time. You know, his area of coverage is quite different from mine. In fact, I get shivers when I hear about them. You know, so...
Do you want to elaborate on that?
So, but I'm happy to hear from Oge, and I do hear from Oge. In fact, the ONEP office in Nigeria is actually hosting the USIP office in Nigeria. So that's how closely we can work together. So that's not a problem. But I think that because the strategy or the policy is informed by all the different strata, then I think that perhaps is the USIP or other agencies like USAID and all of that will need to have a better strategy to communicate such information. And I'm also aware that during the consultative meeting processes, Oge reached out to a couple of institutions, and other people did, including USAID, organizing focus group discussions. So I think there's been a lot of voice that went into the development of the strategy. The issue is, and that's where I come back to you, Mark, what kind of investment? Because it's not enough to talk about the 3 Ds, because we are going to hold you responsible in terms of the investment you're making in each of the Ds. And unfortunately, most times the defense is always higher. you know. And based on what Oge talked about in terms of building resilience, developing sustainable peace architecture, how do you take a pause? Since these are still part of lessons learned, how do you pause and evaluate how much have you invested in defense and how much do you want to invest now in the remaining 2 Ds?
So I am not optimistic that I can get Congress to give me more money for the problems that I'm working. So my goal is to assess what we're doing and optimize what we're doing. Make sure that we're spending the money the right way within my D. You might know the figures better than I do, but what's the dollar amount associated with the new act? Because I think this administration is trying to turn the dial up with respect to funding for the other 2 Ds in Africa, but I don't know the figures off the top of my head.
I think it's about 200 million, but that's over 9 countries,
Okay.
9 countries and 1 region. So
Okay. So, but yes, the competition for resources is really intense, and everyone who works in my community wants more money for us to help in Africa. It's hard to get more money. Right now, China, like when you talk to people, everything's China, China, China. So even when I worked in the Russia office, it was hard to persuade people that you know Putin's the guy who's going to cause problems first, right? Everybody was focused on China, China, China. So that's what we're up against. It's a tough competition for resources.
Play, Nicholas, and then, sure, 1 and then 2. He's got the microphone's closer to him right now.
Thank you, Mark. Take this one on the chin. I usually say to some of my students that I see, I have no use for a physicist who does not know anything else other than physics. And you have just spoken about my D. Do you think that's the best approach? Because I think, and this is an opinion, I think one of the issues he's been talking about, the budgeting, which has been concentrating on the defense and forgetting the dialogue, the diplomacy, and what. But don't you think that has been the source of the reflecting? Don't you think that has been the source of the problems of what you called not failures? You used another word. Let me also limited success of the strategy of the USA, because I'm linking my question to what he said. If it is a strategy that is meant to counter Chinese influence and Russian influence for right or wrong reasons, and for us as Africans, all influence have never been good to us. But it's about each country justifying its own issue, and that's quite okay. Everybody sees themselves from their own point of view. So this silo kind of thing, in your opinion, what is? Don't you think it's a cause for some of the limited failures, limited successes?
Yeah.
Just hang on 1 second. In terms of, we want to. There are two things. Our colleagues, we're not finishing, but we're officially finishing. So to our colleagues who are joining us online, thank you very much. Just in the way that administrative things work and technology, I'd first like to thank our colleagues from the AV department who have taken such good care of us. So before we give thanks to everybody else, thank you all very much. We can end the official broadcast thanks to those of you tuning in online.